When I resigned, the CEO laughed. Not politely. Not the kind of laugh people use to soften tension. It was dismissive. Final. He leaned back in his chair as if the conversation had already ended before I finished speaking. You're overestimating your importance, he said. The room stayed quiet. Board members sat along the polished conference table, pretending to study documents they had already read. HR kept her eyes fixed on a folder that contained my resignation letter. Someone near the window shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The CEO continued. People think systems depend on individuals, he said. They don't. Companies survive departures. Then he smiled. And competitors won't hire you. Even if they do, you're not taking anything valuable with you. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else he said. Not taking anything valuable. I nodded slowly. No argument. No dramatic exit. I thanked him for the opportunity, stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of the room. Calmly. Because the most valuable thing I built was never something I needed to take. It was already inside me. 3 years earlier, the company had been in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that makes headlines. The dangerous kind. Silent decline. Enterprise clients weren't complaining. Support tickets weren't exploding. Revenue looked stable on quarterly reports. But renewal rates were slipping. One client decided not to expand. Another delayed renewal discussions. A third quietly reduced usage. Individually, each case looked harmless. Together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to see. Churn wasn't rising suddenly. It was spreading slowly. Executives blamed market pressure. Sales blamed pricing. Product blamed feature gaps. Consultants blamed industry cycles. I blamed behavior. Because customers don't leave when they're angry. They leave when they stop caring. The first signal is almost invisible. Login frequency drops slightly. Weekly activity becomes monthly. Decision makers stop attending review calls. Emails get shorter. Warmer conversations become transactional ones. 6 to 8 weeks before cancellation, disengagement becomes predictable. No one was tracking that layer. So I started building something quietly. At first, it was just scripts pulling behavioral data from scattered systems. Usage logs. Support sentiment analysis. Engagement scoring. Billing interactions. Then it evolved. I created a behavioral retention engine, a model that didn't just predict churn. It predicted intent. It mapped how companies emotionally disengaged before they made financial decisions. The system learned patterns faster than any human team could. When risk crossed a threshold, alerts triggered internally. Sales teams reached out before dissatisfaction surfaced. Product teams addressed issues before clients complained. Executives thought relationships were improving. They weren't. Timing was improving. Within 6 months, churn stabilized. Within a year, retention reached historic highs. Revenue climbed. Investors praised leadership strategy. The CEO appeared on industry podcasts discussing vision and culture. The board celebrated executive excellence. My work stayed mostly invisible. Which was exactly how I wanted it. Because recognition fades. Leverage compounds. The real power of the system wasn't the code. Anyone can read code. The real power was the decision logic underneath it. Hundreds of small adjustments I made over time. Manual overrides during sensitive negotiations. Custom waiting for industries under regulatory pressure. Exceptions built from intuition rather than documentation. I never fully documented those decisions. Not intentionally. I simply understood something most engineers learn too late. Documentation transfers knowledge. Incomplete documentation preserves influence. 2 years after deployment, retention became the company's defining strength. Competitors struggled while we expanded. Analysts credited executive leadership. The CEO began believing his own narrative. Success changes people. Especially leaders who inherit systems they didn't build. Meetings shifted. Technical discussions shortened. Strategic language replaced operational understanding. Eventually, infrastructure became something executives assumed would always work. Invisible systems create invisible dependency. And invisible dependency creates dangerous confidence. The first sign of change came during a quarterly planning session. The CEO interrupted me mid-presentation. "We need scalable thinking," he said. The phrase sounded impressive. It also meant decisions were moving away from reality. Over the next months, leadership restructured departments. Efficiency initiatives. Cost optimization, external consultants. Each change reduced technical influence in executive conversations. Eventually, infrastructure became categorized as maintenance rather than strategy. I watched carefully. Not angry. Just observant. Because organizations reveal their future long before they realize it themselves. Then came the restructuring announcement. My role, they explained, had evolved beyond necessity. Translation: the system worked so well they believed it no longer needed its architect. That's why the CEO laughed when I resigned. He genuinely believed the company had outgrown me. He thought the machine ran itself. He didn't understand that systems don't fail when they break. They fail when context disappears. 2 weeks after leaving, I received an offer from their largest competitor. They didn't ask about code. They asked about outcomes. How did you reduce churn without increasing costs? That question told me everything. They understood value. I joined as head of growth architecture. New environment. New data. Same industry. I rebuilt the behavioral model from memory. But this time, I improved it. Cleaner signal prioritization. Faster predictive cycles. Executive level alerts tied directly to revenue risk. Instead of reacting to dissatisfaction, we anticipated it. Instead of selling harder, we arrived earlier. We didn't chase clients. We met them at the exact moment they began doubting their current provider. The results appeared slowly. One enterprise account switched. Then another. Nothing dramatic. No aggressive poaching. Just better timing. My former company barely noticed. At first. Then quarterly reports showed subtle anomalies. Renewals declining slightly. Expansion slowing. Leadership blamed macroeconomics. But the pattern intensified. Clients weren't leaving randomly. They were leaving precisely. Accounts exiting weeks before renewal discussions. Transitions occurring without conflict. When analysts finally compared churn data against competitor growth, the overlap became impossible to ignore. Every major client loss aligned with our expansion. And my name began appearing again in industry conversations. Inside their boardroom, questions changed. Not why are clients leaving? But how are they predicting us so accurately? That question marked the moment realization began. Because they weren't losing clients to marketing. They were losing clients to understanding. Late one evening, months after my departure, my phone rang. The CEO's name appeared on the screen. I watched it ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then I answered. His voice sounded different. Measured. Careful. I think we should talk, he said, and for the first time since I resigned. He didn't laugh. I think we should talk, he said. There was no laughter in his voice this time. No arrogance. Just restraint. About what? I asked. A pause. The retention system. He still didn't understand. He thought this was about code. It never was. You have the system, I said calmly. We have the framework, he corrected. Not the results. That distinction mattered. Frameworks can be copied. Outcomes cannot. I didn't rush to respond. Silence is a negotiation tool most executives misuse. They try to fill it. They try to control it. I let it sit between us. Finally, he spoke again. Our largest enterprise account is reviewing alternatives. I already knew. My model had flagged them weeks earlier. Usage decay. Reduced executive engagement. Delayed internal escalations. Classic pre-exit behavior. How long? I asked. 2 weeks. Maybe less. That account represented stability. Visibility. Investor confidence. If they left, analysts wouldn't call it churn. They would call it structural erosion. And structural erosion spooks markets. What do you want? He asked. That was the moment the power shifted completely. Not when he called. Not when churn doubled. Now. When he asked that question. Because he expected a number. Consulting fee. Equity. Short-term fix. Instead, I asked something else. Who's leading your infrastructure reviews now? He hesitated. Internal team. Meaning no one with historical context. No one who understood why thresholds existed. Why certain accounts had override privileges. Why the system behaved differently under regulatory pressure. You don't need the algorithm, I said quietly. Then what do we need? You need credibility. He exhaled slowly. The word landed heavier than I expected. Because credibility can't be purchased. It must be restored. We can offer consulting, he said. Advisory position. Executive compensation. Still thinking in transactions. Still thinking small. Consulting won't solve this, I replied. Another silence. He didn't argue. That told me more than any defensive response could. Behind him, I could imagine the board's pressure mounting. Quarterly forecasts adjusted downward. Investor calls tense. Analysts asking sharper questions. How are competitors predicting churn so precisely? How are enterprise clients transitioning so smoothly? How does their retention outperform yours using similar pricing? The board wasn't loyal to him. Boards are loyal to performance. And performance was slipping. Weeks earlier, 2 board members had contacted me privately. Not aggressively. Curiously. They wanted insight, not confrontation. They weren't concerned about ego. They were concerned about valuation. And I understood something he didn't. He wasn't negotiating alone. Your board already knows this isn't market fluctuation, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. You've spoken to them, he said. Not a question. A realization. Yes. He didn't sound angry. He sounded cornered. When did this become a merger conversation? He asked carefully. There it was. He had already moved past consulting. Past rehiring. He knew incremental solutions wouldn't repair structural loss. It became a merger conversation, I replied, when churn became predictable. He let out a slow breath. You could almost hear the math running in his head. If the largest enterprise client left, headlines would follow. If headlines followed, stock would dip further. If stock dipped further, board confidence would fracture. Executives survive turbulence. They don't survive predictable decline. You understand this would dilute control, he said. Yes, I replied. And control is already diluted if you can't stabilize retention. He didn't argue. Because it was true. Over the next 72 hours, discussions moved quietly. Board level. Confidential. Not framed as rescue. Framed as strategic alignment. Market optics matter. 12 hours before their earnings call, a press release went live. Strategic Growth Partnership. Joint Infrastructure Oversight. Unified Retention Framework. Shared Data Intelligence Architecture. My company's name beside theirs. The market reacted positively. Investors prefer proactive adaptation over silent erosion. Stock stabilized. Analysts shifted tone. Speculation softened. During the press conference, he stood beside me. No laughter. No smirking dismissal. Measured answers. Careful phrasing. When a journalist asked directly, "Do you regret letting him leave?" The room tightened. He looked at me briefly. Half a second. Then back at the cameras. We've evolved, he said diplomatically. It wasn't an apology. But it wasn't arrogance either. Months passed, the unified retention architecture outperformed previous records. Churn dropped below historic lows. Enterprise stability returned. Revenue projections corrected upward. Board oversight strengthened governance structures. And internally, something changed. He no longer interrupted technical briefings. He asked questions instead. He listened longer. Success had once convinced him systems ran independently of architects. Failure taught him otherwise. One evening, after another strong quarterly call, he approached me privately. No one builds invisible leverage like that, he said. It wasn't praise. It was recognition. He once told me I wasn't taking anything valuable with me. He was right. I didn't take it. I rebuilt it. And this time, it wasn't invisible. It was institutional. Structured. Documented. But strategically governed. Because power isn't in the code. It's in understanding what the code represents. And now he understood something he hadn't before. Architecture doesn't just support companies. It defines who controls them, because the public merger was only the visible outcome. The real shift happened behind closed doors. After the press conference. After the earnings call. After the stock stabilized. That's where power actually rearranges itself. The first sign was subtle. An internal executive restructuring memo. Framed as operational efficiency alignment. In reality, it was containment. The board didn't remove the CEO. They weakened him. 2 new oversight committees were formed. Infrastructure governance. Enterprise retention stability. Both required joint leadership approval. Both required my signature. It wasn't announced dramatically. No headlines. No scandal. But internally, everyone understood. Strategic decisions now had an additional checkpoint. Mine. The CEO still had the title. But influence had shifted. You can tell when power moves in an organization by watching who gets consulted first. Before, infrastructure decisions happened after executive strategy. Now, strategy happened after infrastructure review. That change alone altered the entire rhythm of leadership meetings. He noticed it. Of course he did. But he couldn't challenge it. Because performance numbers justified the structure. Retention stabilized beyond prior highs. Enterprise renewals returned. Expansion revenue improved. Investors were satisfied. Boards don't disrupt success. But something else changed. The executive team began recalibrating their loyalty. Not openly. Quietly. People who once mirrored his tone now softened their positions. They began looping me into conversations early. Asking for input before decisions were finalized. Not because they liked me more. Because they sensed durability. Executives align themselves with stability. Not personality. Meanwhile, the former internal analytics director approached me one afternoon. "I tried to rebuild your model," she admitted. "I know." She smiled faintly. "It wasn't just the logic, was it?" "No," I replied. "It was context. Context is what most leaders undervalue. They believe systems function because code exists. In reality, systems function because someone understands why each layer was built. Without that, replication becomes imitation. And imitation always lags behind adaptation." The CEO requested a private meeting a few weeks later. Not in the boardroom. Not formal. Just the two of us. He looked different. Less performative. More analytical. "You anticipated the churn before we saw it," he said. "Yes." "How?" The question wasn't about software anymore. It was about perspective. "You stopped listening to small signals," I said calmly. "When companies scale, leaders assume stability. But growth amplifies fragility." He absorbed that quietly. For a moment, the dynamic felt different. Not adversarial. Not competitive. Just honest. "I underestimated you," he said finally. That was the closest he would ever come to an apology. "I underestimated the architecture," I corrected gently. He nodded. Because it was true. This was never about ego. It was about structural awareness. Over the next months, internal culture shifted. Infrastructure briefings became mandatory in executive reviews. Predictive modeling became integrated into board forecasting. Retention intelligence was no longer invisible. It became central. But here's the part no one talks about. Power gained through crisis must be handled carefully. If leveraged aggressively, it creates resentment. If leveraged quietly, it creates permanence. I chose permanence. I didn't overrule decisions unnecessarily. I didn't undermine him publicly. I didn't frame past failures as evidence of incompetence. Instead, I reframed them as lessons. The board noticed. Executives noticed. Trust stabilized. And something unexpected happened. The CEO began asking me strategic questions before making public commitments. Not because he was forced to. Because he preferred certainty. That's the final stage of leverage. When your former opponent begins depending on your foresight voluntarily. One afternoon during a quarterly strategy review, an external consultant suggested aggressive pricing changes to accelerate growth. The room buzzed with excitement. The proposal looked attractive on paper. Short-term gains. Immediate revenue spikes. The CEO turned to me. "What does the model say?" 3 years earlier, he would have approved the proposal instantly. Now he waited. "The model predicts accelerated churn in mid-tier enterprise accounts within 2 quarters, I said. Silence settled. The consultant shifted uncomfortably. The CEO nodded slowly. "Then we won't implement it." Decision made. Calmly. Without theatrics. That's when I realized something important. He hadn't just learned caution. He had learned dependence. Not emotional dependence. Structural dependence. He once believed systems ran without architects. Now he understood that architecture guided survival. Months turned into a year. The merger strengthened both companies. Market share expanded. Analyst confidence solidified. And the board eventually made another move. They didn't remove him. They redefined his role. Operational leadership remained his domain. Strategic infrastructure governance shifted fully under my authority. It was presented as evolution. In truth, it was recalibration. The laughter from that resignation meeting felt distant now. Almost irrelevant. Because what he misunderstood that day wasn't my importance. It was invisibility. The most dangerous leverage in any organization is the kind no one sees until it's gone. He thought I wasn't taking anything valuable with me. He was right. I didn't take it. I demonstrated it. And once demonstrated, it could never be dismissed again. Power isn't loud. It doesn't argue in meetings. It doesn't demand recognition. It builds quietly. It observes patiently. And when the moment comes, it shifts the entire structure without raising its voice.